this week is a continuation of the one we began last week. It's manufacturing. And there are a lot of similarities this week in the same kinds of processes that we did last week. One of our objectives today is to touch on the things that are the same, to mention the things that are different, and then try to see how those things that are different are implemented. There are two ways we can account. We can use job order cost systems, which we talked about last week. We can use process cost systems. This week's about process costing. So one of the things that I'd expect you to be curious about is, why are there these two methods? Which one is better for a particular kind of industry? And I began last week with that very topic when you knew practically nothing about manufacturing. You're different today than you were last Monday, and you might hear the explanation for that differently today. I want to talk about it. I've said already that lots of things are the same. We should cling to those things that we mastered last week, that we already know from last week, and concentrate on the differences that we need to add to our knowledge this week. The primary objective we have in this is to allocate the cost to production. We're concerned with two different groups. In order to accomplish this, we need to talk about something called equivalent units. If you want to relate to it at the moment, a simplified version of that would be pretend units. To attempt to measure how hard we work, we're going to quantify our efforts in terms of equivalent units. There are two different subgroups, ways that we could account for this. One is called FIFO, and one is called the weighted average method. I'm going to spend 30 seconds or so in a few minutes about the differences between them. Ultimately, what this comes down to is some predictable steps that you will be able to accomplish to allocate costs to production. And it is that predictable nature of this that makes this something that you could achieve and excel in. Our ultimate goal is to find the cost of goods that we finished. That's what a manufacturing system ought to do. That's what we're always concerned with. Last week we wanted to know what the cost was when we were using job order. And this week we want to know the cost of goods we completed in a process cost fashion. We also are concerned with the goods that remain in the inventory, those on which we are still working, those that we are taking to next period and are going to complete in the following month. We're concerned with reconciling that to prove the accuracy of our work and move on and account for those. So let's talk a little about the differences between job order and process cost accounting. Some of these things are the same things you heard last week that you would just be more ready to hear this week. Let's talk about some of the characteristics we talked about last week. In a job order cost system, we produce unique goods. Those costs that we incur in production can be traced to that specific good on which we're working. They're identifiable, one from another. In process cost accounting, we produce units that are just alike, that all have the same characteristics, that are very difficult or impossible to distinguish one from another. In job order cost accounting, we typically accumulate the cost on job cost sheets. Since they are identifiable, we can distinguish from them and keep up with just the cost for that particular job on which we're working. More typically, in a process cost fashion, we accumulate cost by departments. Maybe it takes more than one process to complete this. So we transfer it from Department A to Department B, and then from Department B to Department C, and then from Department C we complete it and send it on to finished goods. It might take more than one process to do that. The unit costs are not so important to us in job order cost accounting. If we wanted to know that, if that was important, but as it's a project that is just for that thing that we're producing, we're more interested in the total, frankly, and we're very interested in the unit costs that we use to produce these goods in a job order fashion, in a process fashion, because that could be a good decision tool. the unit costs that we allocate to production, we could compare from month to month if we use techniques in the accounting system that allow us to do that. That should be a goal. So here's another twist on the same attempt I'm making to help you differentiate between job order costing and process costing last week and this. I used some examples in class last week. We could expand our knowledge a bit. I used examples of a print shop where a customer might go in and have business cards printed, or someone else would want wedding invitations, or maybe we want some letterhead for our business, or some invoices, or someone else is doing birth announcements, or whatever it is that that job is, each different from another. A time or two I picked up an accounting textbook to use as an example, and really a publisher would use process costing because they were producing a lot of items that were just alike. Now, maybe they produce all the accounting textbooks and then they start producing economics textbooks. So they're not just producing one product, but we're producing a lot of items that are difficult or impossible to distinguish one from another. So still, printing is my point. One facet of printing would use job order, another facet of printing might use process. I used an example of an auto mechanic, even though it wasn't manufacturing per se, that we would need to keep up with the cost incurred for each customer on whose car we were working. A brake job, a tune-up, an oil change. We would allocate those costs to that particular job, charge them a different price at the cash register because we were aware of the costs that we had incurred in production. Well, an automobile manufacturer produces a lot of units that are the same. So Honda or Toyota or General Motors or Chrysler is sending that automobile down the assembly line, and all those costs are probably accounted for in process cost fashion. The only exception might be that near the end of the assembly line, that car, that truck, might become a little more unique by some specific equipment that it had on it. And we could add those on to the process cost that we developed all down the assembly line. So the parallel I'm drawing here is these are both automobile related, but one would use job order and the other would use process costing. I told a story last week about perhaps my wife and I were shopping for new furniture in the living room to do a little remodeling. We could go to a furniture store and choose a new fabric and order one specifically. Or we could buy it off the showroom floor that were produced in mass. A lot were produced exactly the same and accounted for in process cost fashion. I'm trying to get you to see the difference. This is my last attempt today. We could account for houses that we're building in a residential neighborhood in job order fashion. So maybe a builder is building 3 houses in a brand new development. They can be distinguished one from another by their address. So the number of bathtubs delivered to that house, or the number of shingles delivered to that house, or the amount of lumber delivered to that job site could be differentiated between. That would be job order costing. Dell ran a public relations advertising campaign a few years ago that if you would call them, they'd make one just for you. You'd get to specify how you wanted your computer to be. And I think they're still willing to do that. It's just not so evident to us. They would build it to our specifications. We'd get to pick the size of the hard drive and the amount of the memory and all those other things. That'd be job order to the customer's specifications. On a couple of occasions, even though this is manufacturing, I'd like to emphasize that the principles that we learn here are applicable to other places. I used the auto mechanic as an example a little while ago. An accounting firm is an example of a service industry. Yet they would bill their clients differently based on the amount of time that they worked on a particular job site. And the same idea would be true. Whether it was an audit engagement or a tax return, it would be different for every client they served, and they would use something closer to job order where the jobs were different from one another. The costs were traceable to that particular job, the characteristics that we discovered last week. On the other hand, process cost accounting would be applicable in industries that produce large amounts of the same commodity. Pepsi, Campbell's soup, breakfast cereal, oatmeal, bread, gasoline, oil, butane, propane, all produced in bulk fashion at refineries. Or paint. Paint at the paint store is probably a base paint. They produce thousands and thousands and thousands of gallons to sell at their stores. And they become different colors of paint at the counter when you pick the particular color you'd like off of an example. They'll put a little dye in that and shake it all up, and then you've got a unique can of paint, a unique color of paint. But it was produced in process cost fashion to get to that point. I'm hoping you've got a better idea of job order and process cost accounting. And it is process cost accounting that deserves our attention this week. We need to learn what's the same and what's different. The account names are the same. The journal entries that you make to record those are the same. I don't know how to direct to be with you, but frankly, anything less than a 10 on the quiz last week was a slight disappointment to me. We went through the journal entries last week in lecture to acquaint you with those, and I told you that was the basis for these 3 weeks and encouraged you to master it last week. If you still don't know the names of the accounts and the journal entries required, how about setting a personal goal to get better at that today? By tomorrow for sure. The homework problems still make journal entries this week, and they're the same journal entries as last week. And if you still don't know them, you're in a bit of a hole, but you could get out with a little bit of quality effort on your part. You need to know those journal entries. And we're making those same journal entries this week. Last week we talked about what it took to make a product. It takes materials, labor, and overhead. Those same elements of cost are true for the products that we produce this week. We need to know that. It is the entry that moves those costs from production to finished goods that is the distinguishing feature between these 3 chapters. Last week in a job order system, we kept up with the cost on job cost sheets. When we finished some of those, we summed those costs, and that became the amount of this journal entry. Our primary effort this week will be to determine the amount of that journal entry. We want to know what we spent for the goods that we acquired. In process cost accounting, there is some number crunching. There are some things that we need to do. They are predictable. The more times you do them, the more familiar you'll be with them. You'll see a pattern, and it's something that you can master. Finally, we want to move those goods to cost of goods sold when we've sold them. I mentioned earlier, but I thought you might want to make note of it again. Sometimes in process cost accounting, it takes more than one working area in order to finish the product. So last week, where we would have moved from raw materials to work in process, combined it with the other elements of cost, and then moved it on to finished goods, this week we might requisition the raw materials in the first department and work on them enough to transfer them onto the second department and then on to the third department before they become a finished good. You'll probably see that in your homework, where there is more than one working stage. Perhaps we'll see it before the day's over in here. So, let's talk about an idea called conversion cost. While we're on this subject of this diagram and the flow of cost through the accounts, let's get us a definition that we need to know later. There are 3 elements of cost: materials, labor, and overhead. 2 of those represent activities that we enter into to turn a raw material into a finished product. Conversion cost is our attempt to save one allocation. We could allocate the materials cost, allocate the labor cost, and allocate the overhead cost. But because labor and overhead behave the same, we choose to lump them together. In an effort to try to make it more simple for you, it turns out that perhaps we make it more complex. Maybe it would be easier if we just allocated the materials, allocated the labor, and allocated the overhead. But we choose to lump these two together and call them conversion cost. You can remember that. Conversion sounds like an activity. No doubt, labor represents someone's efforts. Think of factory overhead as the machine running. So it takes a machine to help produce this thing. These both represent activities. Conversion cost we lump together and make two allocations to find the cost of the goods we finished. One for the materials, one for all the other costs, labor and overhead, all lumped together. Let's talk about something I mentioned earlier today, this pretend concept of how hard we've worked. It's called equivalent units of production. Defined, equivalent units of production is a measure of how hard we've worked expressed in finished units. There might be some units that we worked on last month but didn't complete. They were here at the beginning of the month, partially completed. We work hard and start on new ones this month and finish those completely. There are some units that we've begun working on that time runs out and we're unable to complete. So really, there is the potential that we have 3 months over which to spread our efforts on the units on which we work. What if all of that work that we expended this month resulted in completed units? What if we didn't have any beginning inventory? What if we didn't have any ending inventory? How many units would we have produced working this hard? That's equivalent units of production. How many units could we have produced working this hard with no beginning inventory and no ending inventory? Are you familiar with the term snowball effect? Yes?
Yeah.
Here's a snowball effect. We depend on the answer in this first step, the equivalent units of production, to make the allocations that we make. If you miss this first step, you miss the rest because it's all dependent on this. And I'm saying that to get your attention, to ask you to really try to understand it today, to give you a good foundation on which to work, and then encourage you to be cautious. So if we think of it this way, it's the same stuff repeated. If I do some of the work last month and some of the work this month, all of that effort together is a completed unit. But I want to know about how hard I worked this month. How many units could I have completed if I worked this hard and finished all of them, had none at the beginning and none at the end? I'm going to keep trying to say that in different ways to try to appeal to you to get you to understand it. So let's say this is the beginning of the month and this is the end of the month. There are materials added at the beginning of the production. To keep things simple for us, every problem we work, every exercise we work, we'll always make that assumption. In another more advanced course, if you take it, you'll learn how to allocate materials gradually. But our assumption is always that materials are added at the beginning. Labor and overhead, on the other hand, are added gradually throughout the process. The more we work, the more we finish. That makes sense. This is the same story I told earlier. It's just a different graphic. When we arrive at work on the first day of the month, we pick up right where we left off. Last month, we worked to finish these goods part way, and we stopped at that point and the month ended. The very next day, we show up for work again, and here are these goods partially completed. I worked to finish them the rest of the way. I have all the materials I need from last month. They were added at the beginning. Some labor and overhead was added last month to finish them part way. I added labor and overhead this month to finish them the rest of the way. Some goods came into the department this month. Materials were added at the beginning. Labor and overhead were added gradually. The longer I worked, the more close I came to finishing them. The longer the machine ran to help, the closer we came to finishing them. And sure enough, we had time to finish that entire batch. Those goods were started and finished this month. All the costs were incurred this month. The materials were added at the beginning. The labor and the overhead was added gradually. And then another group came in. We added the materials to those at the very beginning and worked on them as hard as we could. So the machine is running and the employees are working directly on this batch. And the boss says, go home. Time's up. And you say, oh, boss, but I love my job. Please let me stay a little longer. I want to finish these. No, go home. Oh, but boss, I'm on such a good roll here. Let me finish these goods. No, your wife called. Go home. Y'all with me here? And we have to stop. Those costs were incurred. Those efforts were contributed this month. Tomorrow, the new month begins, and we'll be right there repeating the process. We'll finish those goods the rest of the way next month. Are you with me? Yes or no? Now, the materials costs are different from the labor and the overhead. I've tried to say that carefully lots of times. The materials are added at the beginning. We want to know the cost of the goods that we've completed. The cost of goods that we've completed would be all the cost for that first group, the materials, labor, and overhead, last month and this. This second group would be all the cost we've incurred, materials, labor, and overhead. Those would be the cost of goods we finished. The book sometimes refers to those as transferred out. I used the example today of 3 departments, A, B, and C. So if this is Department C, we could say they were finished. In the others, they're finished in this department, but they're not truly finished. We transfer them out to the next stage of production where we work on them longer, and then to the next department, and then finally to finished goods. Transferred out is a good term. These goods, we have materials cost and labor and overhead for partial completion, but they're not finished. The cost of finished goods is the sum of the costs we incurred on these first 2 batches. All the materials are there. There's materials in all of those units. Equivalent units of production for materials represents all the materials you had available to you to use this month. We add those materials at the beginning. We have enough materials for everything we work on. The labor and overhead, the conversion cost, however, are a little different. This is called the average method. We take the cost incurred in the beginning inventory, the labor and overhead costs, and include them in this month's cost. For some of us detailed people, this is a little annoying. We would rather it come out exactly. We'd rather account for this to the penny. But the book's view is that this is a little simpler. Let's take the beginning inventory and lump those costs in with this batch that we've started and completed this month. We also worked on these part way. This represents the total effort we expended this month, and that will be the basis for which we allocate cost. This is called equivalent units of production for conversion cost. It's called the average method because of lumping the beginning inventory in with this second batch. That's where the averaging takes place. That's where it gets its name. So, I've mentioned FIFO and average method. Now that you've kind of seen how it worked, let me just vent a moment. For a long, long time, we used the FIFO method The allocation that we would normally have made this week was fairly complex, perhaps equivalent to bonds, amortization and selling price and all that number crunching we did a few chapters ago. It would involve a lot of number crunching and a lot of people master it. In this book, in the 6th edition, we switched from FIFO to the average method, and I've accumulated some other comments by others on it. This is our book. It's the method most widely used in practice. I can't refute that. I haven't gone around and taken a survey. I know not whether that's true. In another textbook, it says it's simpler than FIFO, which is my concern that we've just chosen to do it because we think that you can get that and not get the other one. And in that same textbook, here's my opinion too. But the average cost method per unit are not as useful for evaluating the efficiency because they are affected by cost incurred in the previous period. And you saw that on the arrows that I used a moment ago to make my point. We're not as accurate. It accomplishes a system good enough that we can allocate costs. I'm a little concerned about us using that for managerial purposes. How do you accomplish allocating the cost that we incur during a month in production? Twice or 3 times today I've mentioned it's a predictable process in steps. I'd like to introduce you to those steps. The steps in allocating costs to production are: 1, determine the physical units on which you worked. Now, a little while ago I used the expression equivalent units of production and described that as pretend. This concept, the physical units, is reality. These are the real goods. This is the real deal. Determine the goods on which you really worked. Sometimes I try to skip this step, and every time I skip this step, I regret it. Let me highly recommend it to you, even if the problem doesn't remind you to look into the physical units. Let that be your guide. Let that be your outline. And then determine equivalent units of production for materials. Determine equivalent units of production for conversion cost. We treat 2 of these together because they behave the same. 1 is added at the beginning of production. 2 are incurred uniformly throughout production. Since these 2 behave alike, we've got 2 calculations to make. In the conversion cost step, we will be accounting for labor and overhead. Then, determine the unit cost. The unit costs are going to be divided by the answer in step 2. That's where the snowball effect begins. The potential to miss the rest of this is missing step 2. Determine the unit cost for materials and the unit cost for conversion costs, labor and overhead. And then it's optional but desirable to find the total cost that it took to produce 1 unit. And allocate those costs based on this step. Allocate the cost to the goods you finished, our primary objective, and to the goods on which you're still working in order to prove and know that we have performed the procedures accurately. That's how we can build it in and know that we can move on to the next step. These are the steps that I'd like to show you in an exercise we're going to work together. Using these facts, could we determine and accomplish the steps I've just described to you? This is identical to the calculations we're going to have you make all week long in homework and exercises that we do in class so that you can be proficient at this by the end of the week. Let's look at the information. Our company had several processing departments. Cost charged, debited. Cost debited to Department 1 for February totaled $258,600 as follows. There are cost and beginning inventory. In order to accomplish this, we need to know what comprises the beginning inventory. We need to know the distinction between the materials cost and beginning inventory and the conversion cost. The problems will specify that if there is a beginning inventory. We've added materials costs this month. Labor and overhead costs were incurred this month. If you summed all of these, it would sum to the amount in the opening paragraph, 258.6. Records indicate that 3,000 units were in beginning work in process, 30% complete as to conversion cost. 18,000 units were started in production. 4,000 units were in ending work in process, 60% complete as to conversion cost. Materials are entered at the beginning of the process. Earlier this hour, I said every problem we do will have some equivalent statement. Our assumption is consistently all the materials are added at the beginning. Labor and overhead is added gradually throughout the process. Instructions. Determine equivalent units of production and the unit cost for Department 1. Determine the assignment of cost to goods transferred out. Sometimes we nickname them finished. And those still in process that are unfinished, still in this department, still being worked on. There are predictable steps to accomplish this. I've provided you a T account so that we can round up the information that was specified there and keep up with our progress as we go along. If you compare the information in the handout with what I just read and the T account, these are the facts that we were just given. The beginning inventory was split between those costs incurred for materials last month and those labor and overhead costs incurred last month. To that, we added materials, labor, and overhead in this department. The opening paragraph said $258,600 of costs were incurred this month. We have two objectives. Our primary objective is to find the cost of goods finished and transferred on to the next stage of production. Once we post that, we could find the balance of this account. The balance of this account should be those costs that we've incurred that we're still working on. Ending inventory. We should be able to account for those costs as well. We should be able to prove that number, and I think we can do it today. While we're here, let's talk about conversion cost. If you've got calculators today, you could participate and learn more probably if you got them out and made a few calculations along the way. Don't take my word for anything. You ought to calculate and experience it on your own. We define conversion cost as labor and overhead. We could allocate those costs separately, but we're choosing, because they behave the same, to lump them together and allocate them all at once. Let's sum 103.5 and 62.1. That sum is conversion cost of 165.6. May I have auditors?
That's right.
Good. We want to find the unit cost of those soon to be able to allocate them to production. Conversion costs are 165.6. If you had no calculator, jot that in your notes. We're going to use that number later. I'd like for you to know where it came from. So, earlier today, you heard me say step 1 is to find the physical units on which we work. Let's find those physical units. There were some units in the beginning inventory. There were some units that we began working on this month. We added materials at the beginning of the process. There must be materials for all of these. The problem says there were 3,000 units in beginning inventory. Now, perhaps you want to open up your packet so that you can see the information and see the solution as well. Don't just look on the screen and write the number down. Make sure you see where these numbers come from in the data presented. That will help you more when you get ready to do one on your own. Do you see where it says the beginning inventory had 3,000 units in it? Mm-hmm. Do you see where it says we started working on some units this month? 18,000 units were begun in this period. Mm-hmm. Say yes or no that you see it.
Yes.
Good. Then we have physical units, 21,000. There were 21,000 units of materials available for us to work on this month. We need to know what happened to them. Well, let's determine equivalent units. Excuse me, I got one step ahead. Let's determine what happened to those goods. It seems to me that we either finished those goods or we didn't. They were either finished or not finished. Is there any evidence in this problem about either of these numbers?
Yeah.
What does the problem say?
4,000.
Nathan?
4,000 units were in ending working progress.
4,000 did you say, Nathan?
Yes.
4,000 units were not finished. Are you with me or not? With a little bit of information, we should be able to logically figure out a lot. First of all, these 21,000 in this first part of this have to be these. If you look at my labels, these are goods for which we're responsible, goods to account for. And this is our answer to our boss. If our boss says, "What'd you do with those units this month?" We say, "Well, boss, some were finished, some weren't. This is my effort to tell you what I did with them." This sum, 21,000, has to be the same. If 21,000 were available to us, and we know 4,000 of them were not finished. Is that what you said, Nathan?
Yes.
Class? Then whether the book gives you this number or not, sometimes the book will give you every number. But sometimes they'll tease us and give us part of it and ask us to logically figure out the rest. If we know this much, then we must be able to determine that 17,000 units must have come in and gone out this month. We started working on, worked hard enough to have completed and transferred out 17,000 units of materials. If you're with me right this minute, say yes.
Yes.
That's step one. This is physical units. Now we want to talk about the equivalent units. How hard did we work? How many could we have finished this month working as hard as we did if there had been no beginning inventory and no ending inventory? How hard did we work this month? Equivalent units of production for materials is the same as the second calculation you just saw on the screen. Always. Because our assumption is all the materials are added at the beginning. The equivalent units for materials are equal to the actual units for materials. That has to be true. You just saw 17,000 plus 4,000 is 21,000. That's the same calculation. Physical units and equivalent units for materials are the same. We added them at the beginning of the process. Equivalent units of production for conversion costs are different because they're added gradually throughout the month. Does the problem tell us any of this information? What does it take to finish that first batch? It takes enough effort to complete them. Now that's just good common sense. How did you finish these goods? There are 17,000 units of materials here. By expending 17,000 units of labor and overhead, we declare they are finished. Would 16,000 units of labor and overhead do it? No. Would 19,000 units of labor and overhead be smart? These are chocolate chip cookies we're baking. We just burnt the cookies. Are y'all with me or not? Yes or no?
Yes.
It's the three bears and the porridge, folks. 16,000 is not quite right. 19,000 is not quite right. 17,000 is just right. Are you with me here? That's what it took to finish this batch. That just makes common sense. Now, how hard did we work on this batch? The problem says for the 4,000 units in ending inventory, we expended how much effort? There's a percentage stated in the facts. Say it to me.
60%.
We finished them 60% of the way. We worked as hard as we could. That's the equivalent of 2,400 units. But not one of them was finished. If they had been finished, we would have accounted for them on the top line called finished. This entire batch is partially complete, 60% of the way, but not one of them is finished. Are y'all with me or not?
Mm-hmm.
The equivalent is 2,400 units. If I worked this hard on this batch with nothing in beginning inventory and didn't finish with any at the end, if I finished each unit before I began working on the next unit, I would have completed 2,400 units. Equivalent units of production. This sum, 17,000 plus 2,400, is 19,400, the number of units we finished. Sorry, the number of equivalent units of production. Equivalent units of production for materials, equivalent units of production for labor and overhead, conversion cost. Now what are we going to do with those numbers? The problem says find the physical units, find the equivalent units for materials and conversion cost. Find the unit cost. What did we spend per unit? What did we spend starts out in total. Let's find the numbers. In the T account would be the best place to look. It's in the fact circumstance as well, but we gathered up all those costs in the T account. In the beginning inventory, there was $12,000 of materials. Do you see where I got the number? Yes or no? There was also $72,000 of materials added this month. Do you see that in the T account? I have spent a total of $84,000 on materials this month. The beginning inventory said that conversion costs last month were $9,000. We didn't finish that batch. We brought them to this month. That became beginning inventory this month. This month we added labor and overhead costs and we summed them together and got $165,600 a little while ago. Do you remember that? Yes or no? Mm-hmm. We have incurred a total of $174,600 in conversion costs this month. We're going to make two separate allocations. One for materials because they're added at the beginning of the month. One for labor and overhead because they're added gradually throughout the month. Let's account for these total costs per unit. In order to allocate them, it's easier to allocate them per unit. So here are the totals that we determined, and in the previous step, we determined equivalent units of production. I need your help. Find me the equivalent units of production for materials. The number we determined a moment ago was, say it, Daniel? 21,000 of equivalent units of production for materials. Let's divide the materials cost by the materials units. Did you hear how much sense that made? Yeah. Let's divide the materials cost by the materials units. 84,000 divided by 21,000 is, Daniel? $4 we spent per unit on materials this month. If you're with me right this minute, say yes. Let's divide the conversion cost, $174,600, by the conversion units in the previous step. I need help with that number. Equivalent units of production for conversion cost we determined in this problem today in this room. How much? Logan?
19,400.
19,400 has been suggested. Is that the number I'm looking for, class?
Yes.
Yes? Let's divide 174,600, the conversion cost, by the conversion units in the previous step. That makes sense to me. Conversion cost divided by conversion units is conversion cost per unit. Brian, do you have me that number?
$9.
$9?
Yes.
$9 per unit I spent on labor and overhead on each unit on which I worked this month. If you're with me right this minute, please say yes.
Yes.
In my discussions this week, I'm going to use these individual costs to show you one alternative way to allocate the cost to production. I like to show my work. A shortcut that many of you will like because I'm demonstrating it today in lecture. Many of you will do it this way in your homework and in exercises we do, and there's nothing wrong with that, is to sum these two. What does it cost to produce a product this month? It costs $13 per unit. In this department this month, it costs $13 to produce a unit. Then let's allocate the cost to production based on this calculation we've made. Step 4. We want to know the cost of the goods we finished. We finished 17,000 units. We determined that amount earlier today. You should be able to look back in your fact circumstance and find that labeled 17,000 units were finished. We now know what each of those units cost us. Say the number. $13 a piece we spent in producing those. 17,000 units produced at $13 a piece is a total of $221,000. We did all that to make a journal entry. Anybody want to try it? Quickly. Talk to me. Zach, try it.
Debit copy goods sold and credit finished goods.
You're a little ahead of me. Michael, was your hand up?
Yeah.
Go.
Debit finished goods.
And credit.
Credit work in process.
Last week, you should have known this would have led us to debit finished goods, credit work in process. That's the answer I expected of you today. That's a really good answer. Would you address for me the name of this account? Department 1. Why do you suppose we named it Department 1? What does naming it Department 1 suggest? There's probably a Department 2. So the entry from last week that you're comfortable with, debit finished goods, credit work in process, now needs to be edited to debit work in process 2, credit work in process 1. Sometimes you don't know the next department. They'll just suggest there is another department. You could think of it as debit work in process next, credit work in process this. Moving it on. So how many departments did it say in this problem? Does it say several, or does it tell us how many? Let's say there are 3. So if this had been Department 3, we would have debited finished goods, credited work in process 3. Do you see my point? Yes or no?
Yes.
Let's finish it real quickly. Let's post the $221,000 to that account and find the balance of this account. $258,600 minus $221,000 is $37,600 of costs that are remaining here, that will be here to begin next month. That's how many costs we're responsible for. I'm curious to know whether we can prove that. Let's go back and look at the goods in the department in ending inventory and the cost associated with those goods. There are some materials here, 4,000 units of materials. Materials cost us $4 this month. We made that calculation in step 3, I think it was. And we added some effort this month. The equivalent units of effort were 2,400. We determined that in step 2. 60% of the effort on 4,000 units. Those units cost us $9 a piece. 2,400 times $9 is $21,600 of cost we've incurred in this department for labor and overhead this month to produce those goods part way. That sum is the same $37,600. So there's 2 ways to look at this. This sum, those goods finished and those goods not finished, this $258,600 is the same as the total debits in that T account. Here are the costs we were accountable for, and here's how we've accounted for them. Every penny. Or you could look at it as, if you think of the 37.6 as ending inventory, that's the same number we had for ending inventory just now. We accounted for every cost. The best thing that could happen to you right now is that you went and worked some problems and practiced it. Here's a good pattern for you to follow. Have a nice day and a nice week.